So we're here today. So we're here today to talk about labeling, all about labeling. So there's two main kinds of labeling that I'm going to be talking about, from retention and sensitivity. And I'm going to talk a little bit. I'll talk a lot about how you implement these and what really they are. I mean, honestly, why they're important, and really the big differences between the two. So we do need to make sure, obviously, if you're attending this, there's some really good causes going around here. So make sure you throw in some donations. All right, every donation does make a difference. I threw some cash in there. So it is important to do that. So use that little QR code and jump in. We are obviously here because of our sponsors. So this is a lot of work. I've helped put these types of things together, and it is effort. So go into the channels, say hi to people, reach out to them afterwards. It is really important to keep this kind of community alive because of the sponsors that we have today. And we do obviously look for feedback throughout this, so you'll see this in all of the sessions, but please provide the feedback around kind of the setup, and we're all kind of growing through this. So whether it's on direct session or overall, please jump in. So let's kick off with who I am. So my name is Drew Madelung. I am a Microsoft 365 consultant. I work for a company called Reactive. I'm actually based out in Chicago, but live up in Wisconsin. I am a big sports fan, a pretty avid golfer, and that's a picture of my 16-month-old daughter there, who is napping right now, and hopefully will not wake up during this. But I do, for my role, I help people implement Microsoft 365. Usually I've been really into more highly regulated organizations, staying in the security and compliance world. So really helping organizations with their transitions to cloud-based information governance and cloud-based information protection inside of the Microsoft suite, and really trying to align those to their existing requirements that they have. So today, obviously, we're going to be talking about data classification. I want to start at a high level, what we see in organizations outside of just the concepts of technology, and then go into the details of labeling, and then breaking down sensitivity and retention and how they relate to each other, along with providing demos across the board for each of these. But I always kind of have this question open, and for this conversation, I will be monitoring the chat here too to stay up to date with this. So please kind of be open from a chat perspective. If you have any questions or ideas, or you want to share anything in the chat, I have this open. I plan to kind of just talk to it, but where I see a lot of organizations with data classification is, and if you're wondering where to kind of start in your organization, is, do you have an information classification policy? Or do you have a data classification policy? And if you do, when was the last time it was updated? If you don't, what are you doing to classify your information? And this is an area where I've especially seen in the last 2 years really extend out to have more requirements from this about why data classification is important. And regardless of if you're using Microsoft 365, you need to understand what types of sensitive information or what types of retention that you need to have inside of your environment, so you try to lessen the risk that your organization has. So think about where you're at with data classifications, and think about if you have done anything with labels. So I'm going to go through some demos, and maybe you don't even know if you have these labels deployed to your environment, but I'll give you some keys on how you can identify that. And if you're an administrator, I'll be going a lot into how you can administer these as well. So why this is becoming more important, in my opinion, is because of the boundaryless walls that the boundaryless area that we live in, and the requirement that we have for data to be everywhere. And then with the environment that we're in, having people working remote, that was definitely a giant revolution, I would say, for having appropriate classification for your data when you do leave an organization. We're not in the same kind of boundary that we had in the past for retention, being just move into this one location, it's just retained forever, or we don't have retention, or sensitivity where I want to protect my information, but I have no idea what to protect. And by the breaking down of these barriers, you have labeling functionality to try to meet some of your concerns. So I like to think of it as, do you know where your data is? Right? That's one of the core concepts. And if you can use labels to start to identify your data, and then if you have boundaries that you need, you can start to put those in place with the labeling concept that you have in Microsoft 365. Now, when you think about labeling, you have a lot out there. Right? You have requirements, you have reasoning, you have, do we need to archive information? Are we doing something for GDPR? How does this work? What is information governance? What is information protection? Is this actually records management? And all of these really do come together, and Microsoft 365 gives you the platform to meet these different requirements and try to meet the compliance and security goals that you have. So why that's important, right? Why, how does bringing those together, and why does that matter? When you look at the actual data itself, we are working remotely. You have the majority of the workforce all working with mobile devices for work. I think a very powerful number is that 88% of organizations are no longer confident that they detect and prevent loss of sensitive data. People are, so think of that, those go hand in hand. People are working more remote, people are working more on mobile devices, which then if you don't have the proper controls in place, organizations become less confident that they're able to protect their data. When you think about that slide before about how do we need to meet compliance regulations? Do we need to meet this for discovery regulations or for discovery needs that we have? Those all come together to define how we get to this landscape, right? How we get to this large amount of information, this large amount of data in the remote workforce that people need to control. And from a records management standpoint, there were 4.2 billion records compromised in the last year. That is a mountain of information. You have people stating out loud that they're using personal accounts for work. You talking about organizations not having appropriate data governance, which leaves you liable. It leaves you at risk for specific information, for specific risk if, let's say, there is some type of litigation that goes against your organization and you're saying you're retaining that content and you don't actually have it. When you move into some of the recent ones I've worked with in financial services, and also in the public sector and the energy sector, the regulations that you have to meet can be very stringent, and can be complicated in how you bring in information governance and protection controls into your remote working environment. And that's how if you think of a big goal as how can we make organizations be more secure and be more compliant with their litigation and privacy concerns. And that really has how labeling can come into play, because we're going to be labeling things at the data level all the way down at the content level. So if we think about it, you have a large set of company information. It could be anywhere. You then have structured systems. So I think of email, right? A structured system that you have data in. You have unstructured data that lives across your file shares, or other applications that you're running in. You even have paper still that you have to think about when you're looking at your information governance plan or your labeling concepts. You get more detailed into your business records that you have to comply with standards to make sure you can discover those and bring those back up in your organization, all the way down to personal data that users have that needs to be protected and retained. And all of this together gives you that Venn diagram of where do we need to start, right? How can we take labeling and start to identify where this data is? And we have a couple challenges when we move into that, right? So you have this idea of this is happening, but how do we think about the challenges and the strategies to make this successful? So there is a mountain of data. 163 zettabytes of data will be created by 2025. That the sooner you can move to a data governance and information protection plan strategy, the better you'll be as your data continues to expand. The compliance regulations that are out there that a lot of them we have to meet from an information governance standpoint are changing all the time, and you cannot have a single person responsible for managing that information. record and retention rules will continuously change, protection rules will continuously change, technologies will change. It is a shared responsibility to define your information governance and protection rules, to define what those labels will be, and how do you and then how do you deploy those out to your end users and continuously update them. I like to think of this as not a one-time push for labeling. It is a continuous business process that you grow, and it becomes part of your business strategy, is having labeling available to your employees. And with that, you want to think about end-to-end tools or end-to-end scenarios where to meet those goals. So some organizations, you might have some data classification tools already. You might be using a different tool for retention. You might be, let's say you're sending your paper out to Iron Mountain or something, like that's okay. So think about how you can integrate those tools into your data labeling and classification strategy, and use the integrated tools in Microsoft 365 to support you. There are scenarios where you need to branch out or where you need to expand into potentially your business needs, but be okay with that. Don't try to boil the ocean, everything using labeling in Microsoft 365. Use tools that integrate into other systems, and use tools then that integrate into Microsoft 365. And now you can even bring some data into Microsoft 365 that's not that standard data, which is really cool from a compliance standpoint. So what does this look like when you get into more specifics around information protection and governance? And that's the language that I'm going to use. That's the language that Microsoft uses when you look at labeling, is going to be around the protection of information and the governance of information. And the approach to this is a unified one. We're going to have a unified approach to classification, to labeling, to discovering that data. It's a unified approach coming down from Microsoft 365. We no longer have the disparate systems of Azure Information Protection on the side, or Windows Information Protection providing classifications here or labeling here. You bring them all together into a unified approach under the information protection and information governance pillars inside of Microsoft and inside of your organization. I've seen a lot of companies start to hire information governance employees to start to lead the hierarchy and the classification of the information. Now with this, we have multiple capabilities, which I'll talk through, on how you can kind of manage and deploy information protection and governance. You can do it automatically, you can do it manually, but the key scenario is they're policy-based deployments. I build a policy, I deploy that policy, and that policy is going to do something, and that label is going to do something. And once that's out there, you're able to monitor it and identify what's going on, whether it's going to be a retention label that starts to remove information, if it's going to be a sensitive label which starts to protect information. You get to break this down into these specific policies for protection and governance that involve sensitivity labels and retention labels. So whenever you're working through protection and under the information protection barrier or boundary, that's what you'll find sensitivity labels. And sensitivity labels are what you'll be able to use for protection. Under the information governance tier, that you have the concept of retention labels. So think of, and I'll go much more into this, but there are differences between those two. So the language when I go through this, information protection is sensitivity, and information governance is retention. But that approach that we have is a unified approach that they have different needs, but you still have the concept of classification. And before that, you get to discover it, and after it, you get to monitor it, and it goes seamlessly across your applications. So you're not having to build disparate systems. So what does kind of the flow look like for this? So I kind of started out talking about knowing your data. If you think about where you want to, where we start, and the reasons for this is really understanding what your data is, protecting that data, so ensuring that you have access restrictions, only the right people have access. If I send an email, I'm then able to prevent data loss from it. So think of, I have some intellectual property. I then need to, I need to share it with the vendor. What if I put the wrong email address in? How can I prevent that from happening? How can I prevent, even if someone does access a system, that they can't get to it? And then think about that following that same scenario. Let's say I had that intellectual property. How do I make sure that that intellectual property is retained and not deleted? So just because it's protected doesn't mean someone who does have access couldn't go in and delete it. We might need to have other retention controls on that to say, great, here's some intellectual property. I'm going to keep it in this location. It's going to be protected in this location. It's also going to be retained in this location. And when you follow this, you can think of the life cycle of your file kind of moving through these scenarios and identifying the different classification types that you have for your data to build out your information protection and governance plan. So going into sensitivity labels and retention labels. So there are two categories. These are the two types of labels in Microsoft 365, and the sensitivity labels themselves are built for protection. They are built to classify your content and protect that content. And it has, when you do this, it's for files, emails. You can put them on, obviously put them on documents. You can put them on your team sites. You can put them on your Microsoft 365 groups. You can put them on your SharePoint sites. And you can actually start to put them in Power BI now and put them in Azure Purview. But think of this as a way to classify information that I want to have a specific type of protection on it, some security control. The most common scenario you're going to see is I want to take a file, or I want to send an email, and let's say I take this file and I attach it to an email. Only specific people who get that email should be able to access it. The concepts of sensitivity labels can meet that. Or if you go into sites and groups, you could say, maybe I have a SharePoint, I create a Microsoft team, and I want to I want to block external access from it. Think of that as like a policy control you can have that goes to protect information. So sensitivities are built to protect, and they get to stay and they persist with that content. So if I think about data leaving my organization, I've classified that, it's going to follow along with that. And I deploy that by user. Now, retention labels are built to preserve, to classify and preserve. So this is really built around retention and deletion. So it's right in the name, but retention labels can do deletion. So common scenarios would be, I need to retain this content for 1 year. I need to delete this content after 1 year. I need to mark this content as a record after a certain amount of time. But really, the reasoning for retention label stays within your organization. Right? I'm going to deploy it to a location, and all the data in this location is going to have the ability to be retained for a period of time. Now we manage this through the UI. So the building and creation of labels is all done through the security and compliance centers. So there are two locations for this. The primary one will be in this conversation around labeling is the Compliance Center. So under compliance.microsoft.com, that's where you're able to see your information protection and information governance location to start to break down your data classification. So with that, I'm going to pull this up right here. I'm going to talk a little bit about the information classification capabilities inside of Microsoft 365. So how do you get there? Right? How do I, where would I start to even create my labels? So where you get started is going to be if you're in the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, you are going to go under compliance. And that does require specific permissions to do this. I'm running this just in my demo in this environment as a global administrator, but there are roles that you can assign out to perform different classification capabilities. So once I go out into the Microsoft 365 Compliance Center, what you're going to see, zoom in a little bit here. What you're going to see down here on the left is we have two different navigation panes, one for information governance and one for information protection. So when I'm here, there's also going to be a section up on top called data classification. So I'm going to start up at data classification, but remember the language we're talking about is going to be under information governance and information protection. So under data classification, this is a newer view to start to show what types of content exists in your organization. So think about the know your data scenario, right? How do I want to know how can I really identify my data? And that really goes into what is the type of data that's in my environment and what are people doing with it? So obviously this is a large environment. In very large ones, you see a lot of interesting information, but I would like to see what are the top sensitivity labels applied to this content? what are the top retention labels applied to this content? And you'll see what are the type of information, sensitive information types, which I'll go into, which helps you identify what should be classified as sensitive or what should be retained. But when you're thinking about labeling, they all live under the data classification umbrella, right? They're talking about you have a unified approach to this. And that unified approach is around data classification, which is why you see sensitivity and retention in the same locations when you're viewing this information. You can see the different activities, and you can go all the way down into who's doing what at what time. So what are the different labels being applied, who's applying those labels, what's happened if someone changes them. You get all of this information available to you to really start to identify and know what your information is. So who is, if people aren't retaining the right information, if people are, one organization I recently worked with, we put in a process to have like a quarterly review for this. So almost like a cleanup day where we look at this and say, great, how much data is actually being retained? Are there any scenarios that are being missed for core pieces of content? And use this information to really dive into it, to see who is and what type of information is being captured inside of your environment. Under the information protection, under information governance, this is where we are going to out and create our labels, which I'll come back to. I'm going to definitely dive into all of this. And same with information protection. This is where we're going to also be creating our labels. So both of these are going to be your core locations that we build and deploy these policies out into your organization. Now, what does this look like? Oh, actually, I'll pause there for a second. Before I kind of get into the details around sensitivity and retention, any questions about that at a high level? Sounds good. So let's talk. That's your question, Andy. So Andy, you asked a question around, is there a way to be more proactive rather than always reactive? So around labeling, so how can you be more proactive in identifying your content and protecting your content? And I'm going to try, that's a really good question, Andy. That is, I'll break through that throughout the process then, actually. There are multiple scenarios where you can start to move to be proactive versus reactive, and that's where the different policy controls can be in place. So sensitivity labels give you policy controls, and retention labels give you policy controls, and those you can automate. Those are ones you can say, I want to do this, and I don't have to worry about what the user does. It's going to happen. And that's how you can become more proactive. It does take time to identify those scenarios, but as I kind of walk through these, I'll break down, I'll try to make sure I break down where you can be more upfront versus saying, like, I mean, I can understand the question, right? Oh, someone sent this email out and it was marked as highly confidential. What do I do with it? Right, it's already happened. Definitely a scenario that can happen that you want to move forward in your identification when you build that strategy. As far as rights management, I'll talk about that as we move through sensitivity labels. I'm not going to go fully into RMS. They are backed by it, but Aaron, if you have a question at the end, I can definitely go much deeper into RMS and how that works with the labeling concept here. But in general, as we move into sensitivity labels, the capabilities for sensitivity are powered by Azure RMS, to be honest, like behind the scenes. The encryption capabilities uses Azure RMS. The protection capabilities, really, when I say protection, I'm saying encryption. Those use rights management behind the scenes to manage those. And but with that, when you think, if you go just a little bit step higher with encryption, there are the umbrella of sensitivity labels is under Microsoft Information Protection. And MIP is a kind of conglomerate of solutions that's come together, which includes AIP, the evolution of AIP, which is sensitivity labels, and the really the kind of the growth of data loss prevention, which includes endpoint DLP, inline DLP, the in-transit DLP that you have, and now the on-premises DLP available through MIP, through Microsoft Information Protection. But these come together to say we have the solution and sensitivity labels fall inside of it. And two core areas where sensitivity labels are applied that we see the most effort. Number one, obviously, is at document and content level, but then you can also do it at a service level, at the container level. Now, what are sensitivity labels specifically? So what's really important is that they persist with the file. That is a key. If you take one thing away from sensitivity labels, is if I classify a file, if I add a sensitivity label to it, that is with the file. Whether I upload it to Box, whether I move it to send it out through Gmail, if I send it out internally, it doesn't matter. That file or that classification, that label will stay with it. And other systems can read that, and you can build DLP policies based on that. So if you want to find a way to be more reactive, right, you can build automatic controls to say, when I have this type of information, it has sensitive information in it, I want to add a protection on this file. And then with that, that's going to then in turn provide a DLP policy based on that. So if I do that, you will have the ability to protect that information based on your DLP policy itself. And that's really can be really powerful now, especially with endpoint DLP. So it moves all the way to the level of if I download a file onto my Windows 10 device, and if it has sensitive information in it, I could block that from being uploaded to another website, even if it's outside the browser, even if it's outside of my like inline, if outside of email, or if I try to move it to a USB file, I can block that as well. And you can do this at rest, and you can do this while it's in transit. So think of all the files sitting there, or while it's in motion, I can apply these sensitivity labels to it. When you apply sensitivity labels to files and emails, really the protection at a document level, the core things you can do are going to be applying the encryption to protect the content, apply the classification in general, just to say this data is being classified, and then you can really apply some very helpful watermarks or visual markings on that file to say, hey, this file is highly confidential, proprietary to X, like proprietary to customer or something like that. And users, right, once I classify it, it's going to be staying consistent with that file, whether the file's in my organization or out of it. And with that, you can provide those DLP controls. And as I showed you, look at the administrative reports to see what people are doing. So there are different ways to do this. You can do this automatically. You can do this to say, based on as I'm creating content or as I'm sending content, I can automatically classify this content. You can do a level of recommended, which is we think it's okay, right? I'm going to give you an idea, like we think this is going to be sensitive, but you, the user, still need to classify it, because a lot of this is empowering the users to apply these sensitivity labels. You can do just overrides for them. So if someone, a user, created something that's confidential and we identify it, you can actually override and say, actually, that's highly confidential. And if they want to take it back, it'd be like, are you sure? You got to justify this. And then that gets logged consistently. So really automatic or manual, either way, you can get data to be classified using these labels. And I really want to make sure we understand this, that it does stay with it. So it is metadata that sits within the file. You can look at it. That's how other third parties can view it, but that metadata follows it. So if we mark the file as confidential, it will roll with it. And actually, instead of this one, I'm going to actually go straight into the demo for the containers, because I think it's a better looking demo. So what does this look like from a files level? So when I open up, as we talked about with sensitivity labels, I'm applying a label or a classification to a file. So if I'm going to go into my SharePoint site, I'm going to look at my list or my document library here. You're going to see I've added a sensitivity column, which is available to users to show in the view. And you see I have one file that shows business use. So this file has been manually labeled with the sensitivity label of business use. So let me jump into this file. And what you're going to get when you deploy sensitivity labels is, regardless of where I'm at, whatever modality I'm in, if I'm in Word, if I'm in Office, if I'm on my mobile device, if I'm on a Mac, if I'm in the Office suite, I will have the ability, you see right here, to apply sensitivity labels. So this is our sensitivity dropdown. what I've done in this scenario, I've deployed 4 classifications, 1 public, business use, confidential, actually, sorry, 5, because I've had 2 highly confidential ones as well, 1 for all employees and 1 for personnel files. And each of these do different things. So I marked this one as business use. You see, I can actually come in here and I'm going to change this to confidential. So when I change this to confidential, you see down here, it's kind of small on the bottom. I have updated the classification for this file. I didn't really have much with this. That's fine. I could do it again. Let's mark this to highly confidential. So this is now marked as highly confidential all employees. You'll see the way I've done this, you'll see it change it right here. It's a streamlined process to be able to apply those classifications. And depending on the rules that I have, as the classification changes, as you apply it, the policies will protect that information. So this one is now marked as highly confidential. As an example, if I come back in here and I want to, actually I'm gonna create a new file. With this file marked as highly confidential, if I tried to send this file, it actually would be blocked by whoever I sent it to. So they would actually be restricted access from that because of how I classified it. When I'm creating the content, let's say I move it to the Word client. When I open up my Word client, you'll see what I actually have is I have a toolbar here which I've added, which uses a client that's deployed into the device, which allows me to have this nice visual indicator of the classifications that are available to me. And I can change this up, and let's move this up into all employees. I'll mark this one as highly confidential as well. And what I wanted to show here, I didn't refresh the file on the other side, but this is one where I've added a visual marking in here. You'll see in the Word client, I have this experience of seeing the classification. I've added a footer, but what you'll see consistently is this sensitivity dropdown. Wherever I go, if I open up this Word file, I'll have sensitivity. If I go into Excel, I'll open up this confidential Excel file. Here's one where I have the same dropdown up here. You'll see this one I actually have put some RMS permissions in here. So you actually, if you add protection, you can throw an RMS protection that comes with it. But the key takeaway is you have this same visual indicator that as I move throughout this environment, create a new blank presentation, wherever I go, I have this sensitivity capability. And I can start to classify my content. It goes all the way up into email, so I can take my email and I can do the same thing. So this is an example where I've had justification, so I'm actually moving it down to public to say, why would I ever want to send something to the public? Not a great example, but scenario-wise, this is how you're able to come in and classify this content. So I can send this to Drew. If I sent this to myself, this email would come across as confidential, and if I attach something, the email itself and the file itself, the sensitivity labels would stay with them. Now, what are those controls? What can those controls do? So I'm going to go into, let's go to my highly confidential one because this is, click too quick. So if I go to my information protection panel and I go under the labels, you're going to see I have a lot of labels I've created here. I'm just going to go into one that I've already created, which is the highly confidential all employees. I'm going to edit this label. And what you're going to see, you have some options for your display, what it looks like. The next thing you have is going to be your scope. So am I deploying this for files and emails? Am I deploying this for groups and sites? Or am I deploying this now for Azure Purview? What groups and sites means is that when I'm in a site, you'll see right up here, I have this group says external Drew, private group / external. I can actually go in, and when we deploy sensitivity labels, we can deploy these out to sites as well to control different scenarios on the site. So I can go to site information, and you'll actually see I have a sensitivity drop down here, so I can pick different classifications of sensitivity labels I've deployed to the container, which can match, or they can be different to what we've deployed into files. And when I go into this, the options we have is to encrypt, mark the content of the files, so the visual indicators, the protection, for the groups and the site, so within the files themselves, when you configure encryption, this is what you can do with rights management. So there are a lot of different options in here that you can configure for how you assign them. Do you want to do that now? Do you want to do it custom? And when you look at RMS, you have these different capabilities. So the same RMS potential that you had in the past, you can add to your data classifications. Sensitivity labels. I kind of use those interchangeably. It seems to be pretty consistent. From a content marking side, I can add headers, footers, watermarks, and as I talked about, you can actually do automatic labeling for this information as well. So I could say every time content contains a social security number or credit card number, I want to automatically label this one as highly confidential. For the groups in the sites configuration, you can actually control the privacy and the external sharing settings as well.
Hey, Drew, if you don't mind, could I interrupt for a moment?
Yep.
There was a comment here made by Matt Wade.
I saw Matt say that. Hey, Matt. If the site is external and the file on the site is protected, e.g. highly confidential, what does the external person see? Is the security trimmed? So what happens if I protect content? Is it going to stay protected? So I don't have that up in this specific demo from a timing perspective, but it 100% protects it. So what happens is if this is actually an example that I have in this file, or in this demo environment, is if I logged in, so this file is marked as confidential. This site I marked as external. If I brought someone else in, so let's say I invited Matt or Anthony, I invited you into this team. This is a team here. You wouldn't be able to see this file. You could see everything else, but because the encryption stays with the file and is set on the file, if I have the protection to say, and this is an easy example, internal only, right? So my core scenario is you have highly confidential all employees or highly confidential internal or protected internal, something like that. And then you put your protection to say, I want this only to be for my domain. If anyone else accesses this file, like gets onto your team or sees this file, no matter what, they can never get to it unless someone goes in and adds that protection. So in the demo I show, I bring in another user, I log into here, and they'll see 2 files versus 3 because I actually have confidential marked as an internal only, and the site protection does not correlate with the file-based protection. The only relationship that the site sensitivity has down to the file sensitivity is around, I forgot the exact word for it, but it's if you've done something that's less protected, more protected. So if this file is, if I mark the site as public, there's a ranking system for labels. You need it, the ranking is important to know which one kind of wins if you do justification. But what happens is if I create a public site, so if I mark this as public, it's lowest tier, and if I upload highly confidential information into it, there is an email that gets sent out to the site owners or the team owners to say, dude, there's someone uploading content to your site that's marked as public and they're uploading highly confidential content. That's not good. So that's the only real integration that exists now. There's conversations about kind of looping them together, but as it sits, the file wins. If there's encryption, it's set and the security is trimmed across the board wherever you go. So I want to talk retention. Right, so protection, and I usually do a lot of sessions just on protection. I wanted to make sure that we stay at a higher level if we're talking about what these labels are. So when you get into retention, you're going to have different reasons for why you need retention, whether it's protecting critical data or you have more commonly regulatory requirements for organization that you need to meet. I think an easy example is public government entities or the Freedom of Information Act to be able to go query that information. If one of those requests occur, how do you follow through with that? Right? How do you ensure that you're following something like that? So if you do need to procure the information, whether it's files or content for some information, you need to be able to get it. And retention labels are the way that you can do that now in Microsoft 365. So the 2 layers of retention at the highest point, if you have policies and labels. So labels go down to the content level, while policies are broad. So let's say I want to retain everyone's email for 7 years. Right? That's a retention policy you can put in place. I want to delete email and delete it in my sent items after 90 days, something like that. those are generic retention policies that users don't manage. That's a global setting. The retention labels are end user driven, right? The goal is think about your retention environment and how can I move from this record center mindset to in-place records management or end user enabled records management. And that's where retention comes into play. So I could have a file in OneDrive and I'm like, I really don't need to retain all of OneDrive because I could have 5 terabytes of data in there, but this file I need to retain, right? This folder I need to retain. And then we can add just retention on that versus managing it at a container level. And you can really do this for retain or delete. Now, when you do this, you need to think about doing it intelligently. So this isn't just a like, I have a label and I want to go retain this file for 7 years. There is thinking that you need to do before you deploy these, and it works from you basically create similar to sensitivity. You create the label and you deploy it through a policy. Now the labels are going to be managed primarily based on location. So I want to deploy these labels to OneDrive. Or I want to deploy these labels to these 10 SharePoint sites. I want to deploy these labels for files that match this query. I want to deploy these labels for files that fall under, or for emails that have personal information. So that kind of goes from basic into automatic. And now, even with SharePoint syntax and the machine learning models, and machine teaching models, you can say, I'm going to automatically I'm going to scan in 100,000 invoices. I'm going to automatically apply retention labels to these different types of content using SharePoint syntax. And then through that, you can add retention periods, immutability for, so especially those regulatory record labels, which is very powerful. Be careful with those. Or a more advanced scenario around event-based retention. So let's say I was working with an energy company and we had one scenario where I need to retain content until the plant gets closed, until we close this plant. And then if we think about that, the event is the plant closing. Or if you're working a lot in AP and AR, it can be, hey, we're done with this client. We now need to hold their content for 2 years, but after 2 years, delete that content. That's your event. Not just for 7 years, it's after a point in time. And you get to see a lot of that when you dig into the retention file plans or record series that companies have. So why is it important? The companies I talk to, if you retain it, you're privy to report on it. So let's say you're retaining all Teams chat and channel messages right now. If something happens and you need to go under litigation, if it's there, you discover it, you are at the mercy of discovering it. If you get rid of it, you're kind of in the same boat. But honestly, what I see more is people keeping data longer than you should and being liable then for being able to report on that information. And then the opposite, obviously, is if you're not retaining it and you do have compliance controls that say you need to retain this, well, then you're not doing that either. And don't overlook those types of controls in your environment. Now, the principles of retention that you have is honestly the key one is retention always wins. So I like to think of Matt's question you had before around like the sites and the protection, and we think, what if someone comes into that protected file? Protection always wins. Whatever's in protected on that file, it wins. Same with deletion. If a file is marked as to be retained, you ain't gonna delete it. Or if you have like a deletion policy and a retention policy, you're gonna retain it. It's not just gonna delete your content. And same with longest. If you have a 1 year and a 7 year, 7 years are gonna win. So think about that when you're building your policies, that you always have retention is going to be winning if you have a deletion policy. Just because you have deletion, say I want to delete after a year, ain't gonna happen if you have retention on it as well. As far as like aligning the policies for Teams and chat retention, I have not seen them mirror email retention policies one-to-one. I have seen the Teams chat messages be retained similar to Skype, which is a little bit less of retention and more open deletion to say, I want to keep those I want to delete those after a year to protect ourselves. The channel messages have been the more challenging one. I worked with an organization that took 7 months to come up with what it would be, and they decided to keep it for 4 years, because the knowledge inside of channel messages is potentially knowledge in an organization, while chat is not looked at it the same way. And so I see chat going out faster while channels staying longer, and emails, once you go into EXO, I have seen them, the Skype and like deleted items potentially align. Sorry, Teams and deleted items, but email retention has been staying longer. I was with what I've had 2 companies in the last year want to do deletion for Teams chat in 24 hours. I mean, I've had people say, I want, because if you keep it, you got to be able to report on it. They had 0 retention in Skype, and I'm like, that's different in Teams, but realistically, it's a very tricky subject, and I don't think there's a right answer. Probably the core one is just don't retain it forever. Be sure you have some plan and define it with your legal environment and let them kind of push to that decision. With oops, what was I moving? So with that, since I know I'm kind of coming up, I want to jump. I had one more slide. Whoa. I can't tell if you can hear me because I can't see.
Yep, we can hear you.
Whoa, computer froze there for a second. I probably clicked through like 4 slides. I'm back. All right, so I'm going to jump into the demo to kind of show you what retention labels look like, but I do want to show that the way that these are deployed is down through the site to the library to the folder and to the document. So the difference, the core difference between labels and retention labels and sensitivity is when I deploy sensitivity labels, you saw I had it in all my Office content, and I talked about mobile device and Mac. I'm deploying it to the user. I'm like, all right, everyone in this call right now, I'm going to give you these 5 labels. Retention labels aren't deployed by user. They're deployed by the container for where they're at. So it wouldn't be, I want to deploy it to Bob. It would be, I want to deploy it to Bob's mailbox. I want to deploy it to these mailboxes. Or I want to deploy it to these SharePoint sites. And that's where the deployment differs. And what that looks like, so I can go back to this, I'm going to go into my OneDrive. I'll go into, let's go to the site. So I'm going to go back into this document library I was in. I'm going to go into this library I created called retention labels. If I go into it, I've added some columns in here that are automatically populated for you, or automatically there for you. You don't have to create the columns. And I can come in and you'll see what retention labels I've added. Now, if you remember the user experience for sensitivity, it was inside of the files themselves. So I'm in, sensitivity is in here. Retention, since I've deployed it to the container, you apply retention labels through the SharePoint or Teams UI, like through the UI that's not within Office. So I come into this file, I can come down here, and you're going to see the different retention labels that my fun ones that I've deployed to this environment, like test label, test non-record label. But these are all ones I've deployed. And if I mark one of these, let's say I'm going to retain this one that's marked as test, this is going to retain the content for 7 years. So I move off of this, you're going to see it now is marked as test. I now have deployed this, and this is a retention label with retention policy applied to it. If it had record concept, like a disposition concept, that's fine. It would go through the disposition process, but in general, I have now classified this information with a retention label. If I go out into OneDrive, I get the same experience. So I can go into this, let's go into this file here. I look at the label. I get to apply the retention label here as well. If I go into Outlook, jump into Outlook here, you'll see that similar to kind of the retention labels that you had on premises or the retention concepts through the exchange only classifications. Let me go into like this file. Oh, there we go. There's the demo I was gonna. Here's the incompatible. Incompatible was the word I was trying to say for the sensitivity. If you have one that's higher, first the site, get this email. So let's say I want to retain this email, right? I can actually come in here and click this down here. And I can go into transactions, assign policy, and you'll see the retention labels that I have here, all available. And with that, it gives you the ability to retain that content with the labels being deployed to those containers. If I go into information governance, you're going to see here's all the labels that I've deployed. Similar concept, I build a label, deploy the label through a policy, and you define what that retention information is going to be within the label and the policy themselves. So what I want to end on is this bad boy right here. So there are multiple things that I mentioned around the capabilities for this. This does require different kinds of licensing. So anything, I've tried to highlight them here. Basically, if you do anything that's automatic, so if you want to do advanced, if you want to use the information governance, records management, those are all going to be under your E5 SKU, or if you go through the E5 compliance suite, then if you're really starting to get into information protection, that lives in your EMS suite for getting information. So if you just sit in your M365 E3, you get some basic capabilities, but you don't get the advanced information protection or the advanced information records management to go through that. And the way I recommend deploying this is through a crawl, walk, or run strategy. Identify your goals. Pick out ideas for each of your phase. Make sure you give yourself time to get started. So don't boil the ocean is the biggest thing. Don't deploy retention labels, sensitivity labels at once. Don't deploy everything with encryption on day one. Don't just randomly deploy retention labels out to your entire organization. Think about what you need to have. Think about how they fit in your organization and build into it. Don't go all the way in on day one. It's definitely way too complicated. And with that, you can get a hold of me through my email, through Twitter, through my website. I didn't upload these slides yet, so I'll get these uploaded before the end of the day and upload onto the team site here as well. And I'll stick around here for my 5 minutes extra if anyone has any questions. And Aaron, so I'll leave this here. Aaron, your question around how many labels, too many labels. So I've deployed sensitivity labels 3 different times this year. We've sat between 4 and 7 labels every time. That's about the number I get to. I really like to deploy them, and you really start with somewhere, start with a pilot, deploy them to figure out how many, what kind of feedback you need, right? An example, we had to, the last customer we deployed to, we had to add an unclassified label just because it had to work for sensitivity. Now, that sensitivity for retention, I had an organization, the last 2 have had over 1,000 to 1,500 different record labels that they assumed on premises. And we tried to consolidate that down into like way less. I mean, the goal would be 20, our goal was 20 to 30. I think we got down to like 150 for retention, but there are very different scenarios for retention labels versus sensitivity. Sensitivity much smaller, retention is usually bigger, and you have, especially for a pre-existing record series. And when you're moving, the biggest hurdle I see is users actually doing it. It's honestly not that bad technology-wise. I didn't spend too much time on the admin side and even the showing side, because you build a label, there's about 3 screens, and you click deploy, and you're done. It's the change management. It's the awareness of why these are important to your users. And I'd say the difference between retention and sensitivity is, for sensitivity, you want to tell your users why you're doing it and what is the impact for when you apply a sensitivity label. Why should the user classify something as highly confidential? Why is it important to them? And informing them it's going to be on all of their office environments. For retention, it's usually a much smaller subset of people, like records managers or information governance people, that are going to be required. And for them, it's actually doing it. Like that UI to go in and click the retention label is not very good. So you do need to give yourself some time to figure out how to teach people how to do the retention labels. I usually go automatic. I see sensitivity as manual, retention is automatic these days.